Good evening to you, dear guests. Today to our fifth and last evening of the Quality of City in 2017. Before we start with the introduction, 2 or 3 organizational information for you. First of all, there is an If you would like to hear this evening in English, we have a live translator here. Just pick up the little headset here you'll find at the entrance in order to hear the translated tone. This evening is going to be held in German, and the translation is going to be into English. And second of all, this evening too will be streamed live on the internet, which means that if you place a word, it will be recorded, it will be streamed. Just be aware that you might end up on the internet as well. Well, then let's start straight away with the last evening of our series, The Quality of the City for 2017. And today our main subject is going to be integration of the city society. Today, with the subject of the evening, first of all, there is the introduction of Martina Löw, whom you know from our previous sessions here. She's working for the Technical University of Berlin and Department of Sociology. And we're going to talk about emancipation in the space. And just like the last evenings, we will today and this evening not going to start with a lecture, but let's say with a dialogue in order to spotlight on certain subjects. And then it's going to be a little break just prior to 7 p.m. And then shortly afterwards, we're going to start with a discussion here. And I shall introduce the guest to you then. And at the start of our panel discussion session, there's going to be a little impulse lecture, you could call it, in order to introduce you to the subject. Let's start. Well, first of all, I have to introduce myself. I'm Robert Hube of Zukunftsgeraeusche. We're allowed to hold this evening series for the 3rd year already in cooperation with the Architectural Chamber of Berlin, also with the Technical University of Berlin Department of Sociology. And thank you so much for the Bundeszentrale Politische Bildung, the Federal Department of Germany for Education. And as I just wanted to say, today we're gonna shed a light on the previous evenings of this series. And in order to introduce today's topic, and today's title is going to be Emancipation and Integration in Space. And we've talked about this in the 4 previous evenings about space that's structured by society. And we came a little closer to the core of these subjects. And, you know, we're dealing with architecture and also other subjects. But this is not only our core subject. And this is a very special point this evening that we were allowed to hold 5 evenings moving around one core subject and trying to enlighten you a little bit. Our first event, reservedness and a blasé attitude, that was the introduction of this series of 5 evenings. And from your perspective, could you just tell us a little bit about reservedness, intellectuality, and a blasé attitude. We were dealing with the script of Simmel from 1903 and found out how up-to-date this script still is from 1903. And we were talking and thinking of the qualities of the citizen of the city, thinking of how much of avant-garde there still is in the city. And we were talking about performativity as opposed to the subject of being alienated in the city. And we talked about Berkening. The alien is identified by doing things in a different way. I think that's a very good definition. Also in the subject of performativity, then we're talking about integration processes. And there was a lot to talk about. We were talking about the new man's society theory and also trends, lifestyle, religious lifestyles even. And we heard a lecture of Miss Spillersberg about differentiating in the cities. And one of these aspects we were talking about the transformator building here, which could be called a crystallization point of juvenile people trying to escape what was pre-planned for them in their life. A third subject was performance, performativity. We're talking about how this subject came into being, what the definition is. Uwe Wirth was holding a lecture here introducing us, talking about John L. Austin, the theory of speaking acts, and performativity, and the city air that makes free. We were talking about emancipation, also in the historic. And as you might know, Stadtluft macht frei, which means city air makes free. That was one of our core theses here for the third evening. And in the 90s, this performativity became an important subject, an important term. And last but not least, on last Tuesday, we were holding a session on big city narratives, also in the movies. And naturally, how can I put it? We're talking about interpretation and reception of the city citizen, also through the media, through art. We're talking about Valerie. There's two ways of narratives. First, the soft alienation. I translate that for you. And lifted perception through your senses. This is the process. Versus an aggressive narration. The city, what comes to terms is the billboards, the advertisements, and then the city is not a process anymore, but it is directed by a minority. And we were talking, Daniel Schwarz, who's working a lot in think tanks, told us about the movie, which could also be a tool of architects to reactivate communities. Well, that was my little looking back on 4 very nice evenings. I gained a lot from that. And Martina, would you like to add or share a little bit on these subjects, please? And then I have a few terms that I want to introduce you to and declinate them. Yes, what came into my mind is that it was rather challenging integration, we should not only see it as an integration of people who move here to the city, of migrants, but integration places a larger question mark here. We're confronted with integration on a large scale in our everyday life. What I found very interesting was thinking of integration. Well, when we're talking about integration, there's always something dominant where other things, where minorities have to be integrated in. And the term inclusion goes away from the level of subjects. We're not talking about people anymore that have to be integrated, but we're talking about spaces to live in, and also relationships, for example, to religion, and education is another subject here. And when we're talking about inclusion, then we're talking much stronger on the system level. Isn't everybody included? The German word inclusion. And it's much more difficult to connect the question of inclusion also with spatial questions, with question of city planning. Well, what spatial relationships does, for example, education have or economy have? And the other thing is talking about people that have to be included. Well, the price being there, that we take into account that there is a dominant culture, as I said before, in which others have to be integrated. But we want to go away from that and go more to a homogeneous, on the same level culture. And on the level of narration, of the spoken word, you mentioned these aspects before. And I think it's very interesting to see what role language plays when we're talking about questions of integration. Maybe even in times where political correctness is something that is questioned by many people. I found that a very interesting aspect here. Yes, the question of these narratives. To make a link with our last evening. First of all, it is the language, as you said, which you mentioned before. What terms are used, what plays a role is also the actual act of speaking. Going back to the theory of performativity, of performance. What kind of reality can I construct by my speaking act is one question. And of course, we're talking about the story of the city. What story of the city is being sold and also reproduced and repeated, and who does so? That's a different aspect of the narrative, which we dealt with on an intensive level. What I want to do is these terms that we use. Let's repeat these terms that we had before. Okay. And you, as our interview guest, I would like to invite you and ask you, and we want to land and in space as a term, which plays a very important role also for, not only for architects. We're going to talk about the space later on. We started with the city as such. even the term of the city, that you could place questions to it. What do we understand when we say city in the first place? Oh yeah, that's a term not so easy to define. Usually you say the city is defined by size, density, and heterogeneity, as opposed to the countryside. There's other positions to do. Richard Sennett, for example, said the difference to the city is the ghetto and the gated community. So there, the aspect of heterogeneity becomes a greater role here. I think that's one decisive question. What do we border the city with? Well, of course, you could add to that when we're talking about bordering yourself off of other spaces. Does it still work that we can say it's the city versus the countryside? Well, the primal urban way of life was adapted, you could say, to country lifestyle. But we still have the question, the citizen of the city and the city itself, what role do they play as avant-garde? What does the city citizen, what's so specific about him in early days as opposed to today? What's the urban lifestyle? If it was adapted already, what's so specific about the urban lifestyle today? Oh yeah, that's something that should really be thought about. Today, we differentiate much more in order to define. When we're talking about gated communities, for example, we used to think of homogeneous societies as urban societies. We're so modern, we're so urbanized, even in villages today. One point still remains, innovations usually come into existence in cities as opposed to the countryside. But these questions don't bring us much further today. We have to talk about heterogeneity and homogeneity. And it's even a provocation to say the urban citizen is not who lives in a gated community. But maybe it's more enticing to think in this direction, especially in one of these evenings where we're talking about integration as a core subject here. Well, thinking about gated communities, you could say it is another village in the city today. Thinking of commuters who come from the simple village, who travels to the city every day in order to work, he encounters heterogeneity. He doesn't live in the city, but maybe he stays there for a couple of days and he jumps back and forth between two very different spheres. And the question is, if you should live in a gated community, how much are you there for the rest of your life? I'm very much looking forward to what Alexander Staub has to share with us on this subject. If there's more and more functions that can be relocated in these gated communities, or maybe even my home, in my own house or wherever, then I actually might succeed in having a completely shut-off life from the city as such. But it doesn't have to do anything with the city anymore, does it? Well, commuting between different types of space that we used to call rural and urban, it doesn't mean that these spaces do not exist. I think we have to start again to think about where to draw the line. Where is the border? Where's the frontier? We have so many borders like we've never had before, even though we're so highly globalized in the world today, in the world order. We have two different types of space that seem to clash against each other. We have highly structured city, and then we have the wish, or we have the necessity, and also the conflicts of differentiating between, you could call it conflict borders, borders that separate conflicting parts of the peoples, or even rich and poor. But when we talk about integration, we really have to talk about separation again. Yeah, that's absolutely true. And that was also the subject of our second evening here. We were talking about drawing lines there, frontiers, borders and edges of systems that we move over, that we transfer in our everyday life. Modern society expects that from us even. And then we're talking about very firm and brisk borders that function as an exclusion. Well, let me pick up the question again, a differentiation between systems that follow a function and also borders that exclude on a structural level. Both are an integral part of what we call modern society. Can we actually achieve by understanding differentiation in an ideal case and also these functional, that we can actually overcome these borders? Or will there always be borders that are absolute and that are so immanent that they cannot be crossed? We were talking about terms of differentiation and the function of systems, of the different milieus, you could call them. Well, not all of you have been here in these evenings, and not all of you are specialists in sociological theories. When we're talking about the functional differentiation of modern society, it's a very strong theorem in modern society. And in a core sense, you could say they function that we have realms of structures that follow their own logic. Well, we have the, for example, juristic systems that follow completely different rules than religious structures. And that brings up the question, of course, what kind of borders are drawn? What systems of differentiation? They can be spatial, but they can also be borders that work on a structural, intellectual level. For example, there could be an act you could do in one realm that makes sense, that doesn't make any sense in the other realm. We can move from one realm to another and find a completely different system of sense, of logic, and that is very astounding in modern societies. And of course that places the question, what does it actually mean for the city builders, for architects? What does it mean for the production of spaces when people, according to the context, find a completely different sense in what they see and what they do and follow a completely different logic and act accordingly? And if it's similar in a structural sense to the way in which we build strong borders that you can see, like walls even, I don't think there has been much research on these aspects. There might be systematic parallels wherever you have a border, if it's a border of sense or an actual build, a manifest border like a wall. realms are not only separated, but also come in contact or differentiated against. If you have a wall between Israel and the Palestinians, then you separate two different types of people, but you bind them together. You connect them in their fate, and I think this is true for both cases. Oh yeah, that's very interesting to see in different areas. We have a lot of walls, we have a lot of borders in our everyday life, in city planning. It's not only specific to the city as we know it. What comes into my mind from my biography is the Chinese example. There were always walls in the streets that I knew, and on the walls at the footpath and so on. But there were also openings for economic reasons where, for example, you had your shops, they were a little higher or a little lower than the pathway. First of all, I thought, oh, is that not all gated communities? But it's a completely different perception of the wall, of the border. We're talking about bringing communities together and what binds them, and not really differentiating them, but it's more a cluster-like organization of micro-societies where everybody knows these arguments that happen on your garden fence. And when people live together, that always happen. We should know that by now, how to deal with it on a laissez-faire level. But still, people get aggravated on these little conflicts, and the question is, where do these mobilizations, where does the trigger actually come from aggravations? You mentioned the wall between the Palestinian areas and Israel. We don't have to look so far. Just remember the Berlin Wall. That was really a blueprint of separation. And you said these two peoples are actually connected, bound together, Palestine and Israel. And the same is true for the GDR border, for the Berlin Wall. You had the narrative of freedom which found its manifestation in the Berlin Wall. That could be seen as the downside of these walls. We're talking about bordering things off, people off, structures off. Let's talk about permeability. How can you move from one side to the other? And so we have to talk about milieus, which means different societies in one city, like a scene, the hood, the ghetto. You are also differentiated by your wealth, by your economy. So it's not only a matter of space. And society could fall apart when you think about hoods, the little scenes, the little ghettos where people live together who are similar. Well, I think most of our guests have already been thinking of these areas. There's areas also that separate, that bring people together in their business. Just think about a group of electronic engineers and a group of teachers. Then, of course, you can instantly imagine how different these two different areas are. Like when you start engineering at a university, you have little money. You buy the cheap bread, and you have your plastic cups and your cheap coffee and so on. Whereas the teachers, they flush their cups, don't use plastic cups, and eat whole rye bread. It's not a cliche I make up right now. This actually is true for different types of businesses where different ways of seeing the world evolve from there. Different ways of dealing with the world, even your nutrition. And what happens then is that these two different areas and groups not only live parallel next to each other, but also above, on top, or lower of the other group. The term of a scene is much softer. It deals more with the subculture, the techno scene and the rapper scene, for example. We're not trying to define a society here with these terms, and we don't see them as a target group for architectures even. It's more a differentiation of youth cultures, of subcultures. Well, it's not only subcultures here that are meant, and it's also these part societies, as you could call them. How shall I put it? I could try to be part of a different type of subculture without integrating myself in it, trying to do specific things like, for example, cooking or helping refugees, sports, your vegan community, you name it. Mr. Kashuba dealt with that in our first event here of this series. Let's make a little jump here to the third event. We were talking about the term of emancipation. That was a strong subject here that we shed light on. Also on a historical level, and we were talking about, as the German proverb, Stadtluft macht frei, the city air makes free. We're dealing with that. Emancipation, first of all, we're thinking of women's liberation, naturally. That's associated with that. But we were thinking a bit about it in a more broader sense. And how is that term anchored in our series here? Well, if you deal with city air makes free, Stadtluft macht frei, then we're thinking of the liberation from the feudal rulership of the early days. And your feudal ruler, he placed a heavy taxation on you, and liberty was not too good way back then. And that's a main subject. And of course, therefore, there's this very strong connection on a historical level with the city society, with the urban society. And I think here today in Europe, when we think about that, when we're talking about urban spaces and societies, we're still thinking of this liberation process. Did I understand you right, that there is cities without emancipation potential? Well, you could at least formulate the question. These are concepts and ways to see the world in a very European context. If it's applicable to, let's say, Laos, that is one big question. It surely applies to some people, to others not. There could be a necessity or a fate to move to the city, and finding there even stronger limitation. than maybe you found there in your rural communities, in your villages. I'd be very cautious and thinking about it in as for single examples and not generalizing it. Yeah, that's true, right? The narrative of the city, we define it as the attractiveness of cities. Of course, that's an imminent part of city, and we're discussing it on a European level. Of course, Ms. Rodenstein was holding a strong point on that subject when we talk about the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages, and the starting of the city cultures, where it was not the question of giving yourself a new biography and redefining yourself, but of course it was more the economic questions that made you move to the cities. So I want to earn money now, I want to be better off, my children's be better off. That's very strong factors on a global scale, so that people flee from the villages, from the countryside, and move to the cities. You could call it, in the broadest sense, an emancipation. You believe you get rid of certain necessities, but you might find new ones, other ones in the city. We're talking about the risk of the city life. It's not only city air makes free, Stadtluft macht frei, but also Stadtluft macht arm, city air makes poor. We're talking about what Süddeutsche Zeitung published. So the rent becomes so high that it's not only a benefit to move to the city. But that wasn't it all for our introduction. We still have a couple of minutes to go. Let's go back to performance. Performativity. That was in each of our evenings and in many talks we're talking about performativity. What actually is that? Why is this the title of this series of evenings? Let me try to give you an answer here. Performativity of the city is meant in a way, as we showed you in the 2 weeks ago, the speaking act becomes reality. For example, when I say, I hereby declare you man and woman, then you actually are married then. And that's also transferable to the question, what does it actually mean when the villager becomes a citizen of the city? That's also an act of performativity, an act of speaking. Well, for me, an important question is, when we talk about performativity in the city, how does the word of a citizen become an actual, let's say, building? What are our conclusions? What is the process? What is the methods, the participation that actually manifests structures, urban buildings? And of course you find the same declination here as in the speaking act. There are certain conditions in order to succeed, so the people who are involved in that process have to be legitimated, and of course they have to mean it. There is a question of honesty, and then you have to push that through what you said in order to manifest it in reality. That is true for these processes. And there's another aspect that came into my mind when we were using that term. There's a dialectic principle even that we imply here. We were talking about the conditions of success that you actually need in order to emancipate yourself in this society. For example, a society where right where law is not given as of yet. You can XYZ speaking acts, you can all say it, but my feudal ruler doesn't give a about it. So there is a dialectic to it. First of all, you have norms and rules of the society that you differentiate in order to come up with that consensus of the citizens. But on the other side, you have to have the option to overcome these determinisms when needed. Could be called paradox in a certain way even. And another aspect is that the individual, despite the fact that he wants to emancipate himself, has to play these roles still. Because without these conventions, without these roles, without the basis of freedom, there is no experience of freedom. And I think that perfectly matches the text of Simmel. Well, what interests me in this connection, if you think it in a broader sense, and many people have written about it even, I would conclude that society actually comes into existence in the very moment. When I'm together with others in a specific constellation, and by our acts of speaking, of doing, of physical acts, of everybody involved, then there's a manifestation of society in these situations. I construct a social room, etc., etc. On one side, it sounds rather elusive, but on the other side, you can imagine there is a concession of these moments that become acts and narratives. And a question that comes into my mind when I think of integration is, of course, you mentioned that before. Into what am I integrating myself? Is it still possible to integrate myself if we're honest? When three people meet and I say, what's your opinion, what's your opinion, what's your opinion? We're thinking about a broader subject, and we have to deal with it. Can we actually integrate ourselves into something larger? I find that interesting. When you give a time dimension to the term of society, the construction of society in this very moment, we have to remind ourselves that each one of us cannot survive a single day without being a part of society. We're not animals following our instincts. We need society as a basis. Maybe it's more obvious even in France. The German word of society is Gesellschaft. But the social of the human being, the human being becoming a social being, that has to be emphasized. That's a prerequisite of our life today. So we have to give ourselves structures. It gives ourselves structures. Not everybody has to reinvent everything on a daily level, but we can rely on our structures. For example, when I come here to this evening and meeting other people, they're not going to beat me up. I can rely on certain social rules, and this only gives us the possibility of living together. Often these rules are not to our liking. We want to change them, and they're in conflict to others, but they protect us, they help us, and we can only live within these boundaries, within this structure. So you always have to keep that in mind. society as a dynamic process. And if you place the question, what do I integrate myself into? I integrate myself into these rules that you could call traditions, conventions, structures that have evolved over the years in our living together in this society. It's, for example, rules like eating with a knife and a fork. You don't have to do that. There's so many different ways of living our everyday life as our human beings, but these are our rules. The knife and the fork, we use that. And this gives us the option of coming together with friends and having a dinner. We have conventions. Who do we meet? What do we eat? At what time do we eat? And we integrate ourselves into these structures, traditions, rituals, and routines, you could call them even. And this is the question when we're thinking about integration, and it's very productive to also see it in a critical way. We want to evolve as a society. We want to remain dynamic, and change always has to be an option, has to be possible. And this we have to renegotiate every now and then. What do we want to change, and what do we inherit? What do we accept as our heritage and what not? Yes, that's right. And for example, if everybody does something in a very completely different way, what do we make of it? We have these rules, we have these structures, everybody applies them in a slightly different way. There's a vast diversification, even in these small structures. And we're talking about homogeneous versus heterogeneous. In the sphere of the urban life, of the city life, do we need a different type of analysis here? Or in consequence, a different way of planning, of city planning? We're going to talk about this later on. Okay, let me say something different. I'm of a different opinion here. I don't think that everybody does things in a completely different ways. Okay, we do have this heterogeneity, but for me, as a social scientist, the question is, what do we agree upon? There's no big problems between young and old, and even about different cultures. If I go to a university, to a lecture room, everybody accepts these processes of education, how this works. And I think there's so many things we have agreed upon, even common ways to see the world, common ways of acting into this world. And I think we should not forget our view on community. What brings us together? What do we do together in a similar way? Oh yeah, that's absolutely true. I didn't want to negate that. For me, the important point was the relationship of the intensity, what we do together. Is that another condition of success? Maybe two different aspects about the performativity related understanding of the city. We were talking about the time perspective. We have a permanent becoming of the city, you could say. And of course, this is a prerequisite of whoever inhabits this city to feel himself as a citizen of that city. And also the relationship of society versus the built stone become manifestation of our rules, of our values. Martina, one last question to you. We're dealing a lot about the spatial developments, and I would like to ask you on your way of space as such. We will have that in discussion later on. Is room the Euclid room where we actually act? Is that integration, emancipation, or whatever you want to call it? We want to talk about the room that's constructed, that is more relative. I would like to ask you for a final statement also on the background, how the reception of space works when we use that term space. Well, even mathematics from 1900 on doesn't believe that the Euclid room is the only room that's actually possible. That's an option. And I think it's no problem to say that, of course, there is a form of the room that we find ourselves in, a container, you could call it. Even Einstein called it that way. And that's one option, that's one way how we can view the room. But that's only one view on space. When we talk about the constitution of the room, let me give you two relevant aspects, I should say. We could talk about a lot more, but I think two aspects are relevant here. Space does not just exist, but it is something that we, humans, by our qualities of bringing objects in relationship to each other actually manifest. I would talk about the achievement of synthesis. You could also put more emphasis on the aspect of perception, but in principle, if we experience a room, then we're talking about the structure between placed objects in order to experience this room as such. And that's the second aspect. It's the aspect of placement. We have very clear rules how objects can be placed in relationship to each other in order for us to perceive it as a room. Sometimes it's a nice way of perception, and sometimes it's a little, we see it a little negative. Sometimes we try to connect, sometimes we try to differentiate. These are all questions. But when we're talking about the constitution of a room, you always have to think of constitutional praxis of placing things there. For example, when you build buildings, where do you place the trees? It's a quality of us humans to bring these objects into a relationship. I should say, when I have a look at the watch right now, let's conclude our little introduction here. We're 5 minutes over the time. There's a little break right now, maybe only just 5 minutes. We want to be in time, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for now. Help yourself with a little snack here, ladies and gentlemen. We have something to drink, something to eat. And we're going to meet in 5 to 10 minutes for a panel discussion. Thank you so much for now.